Suggestions for breaking the current impasse in political reform. Tensions in the South China Sea among topics discussed during John Kerry's visit to China. And Dzhokhar Tsarnaev sentenced to death in connection with the Boston Marathon bombings.
Good evening. A number of proposals were put forward today by local and mainland scholars in a bid to overcome the ongoing impasse over political reform in Hong Kong. Among the ideas is changing the electoral base of the nominating committee and rescheduling the legislature's vote on the reform package. Owen Fung reports.
The government plans to put the political reform package to the vote in the Legislative Council before the summer recess in July. But so far, the proposal has not secured sufficient support from the pan-democratic camp for it to be passed. Mainland legal scholar Rao Geping said today that even if the package was voted down, the central government would continue to work on political reform. Rao, who is also a Basic Law Committee member, added that replacing corporate votes in a nominating committee with individual votes is not in breach of the reform framework set by the National People's Congress Standing Committee. Meanwhile, local legal scholar Albert Chen suggested that the government could consider postponing the legislature's vote on the reform package by rescheduling it until after the LegCo election next year.
Voters in the 2016 Legislative Council election can use the election as a means or as an opportunity to express their views as to whether they support or reject the proposal for universal suffrage in 2017.
Chief Secretary for Administration Carrie Lam, however, dismissed Chen's suggestion. She said there's not enough time to reschedule LegCo's vote on the package. And on changing corporate votes to individual votes, Lam remains adamant that it's not feasible at this stage. She said there's no consensus among stakeholders on the issue and that such changes would complicate matters even further. Owen Fung, TVB News.
A founding member of the Democratic Party has asked other members not to solely focus on vetoing the government's political reform package. La Chi-kwang says they should find a way out of the current political stalemate. Evelina Lung reports.
Many people are making their voices heard before the Legislative Council votes on the government's political reform package. La Chi-kwang of the Democratic Party is one of them. He recently wrote a letter to other members of his party asking them to find a third way between supporting and vetoing the reform package. However, he also said the lawmakers shouldn't accept the government's proposal as it is because the views in society are too divided over the package. Instead, he said they should look for a way out of this political stalemate.
The third way basically is to consider the possibility of making an amendment to the resolution of the government, which include proposals like one is Anson Chan's 2020's proposal, which probably most people don't quite understand, but I do consider that it's quite consistent with the international standard of there's no unreasonable restriction on the election. And the second possibility is the combination of changing all the company votes to individual votes, and also plus the possibility of the none of the above option for the electors to choose in the universal suffrage.
He says past surveys have shown that more than 70% of Hong Kong people will support a proposal that substitutes company votes with individual votes and provides a none of the above choice on the ballots. Law also reminded lawmakers that they are representing the society, not themselves. So they have to take public opinion into consideration when voting on the government's reform package. Evelyn Leung, TVB News.
Pro-democracy protesters last night disrupted an inter-school debating competition attended by Chief Secretary Carrie Lam. In response, Lam has vowed to stay determined in promoting the political reform package. João de Silva reports.
The Chief Secretary for Administration was the event's guest of honour, but her presence at Queen Elizabeth Stadium had the unintended effect of sparking pro-democracy protests at an inter-school debating competition. Activists from groups such as the League of Social Democrats and People Power unfurled yellow umbrellas and the shouting began. Legislator Leung Kwok-heung asked Lam to debate the government's political reform package, and the commotion in the audience continued as the panel of judges, including the director of the Government Information Services Patrick Nip and the former chairman of the Bar Association Paul Xie, reviewed the student debater's performance. Commenting on the protests, Lam said it was regrettable that a non-political event had been disrupted. She said it was a pity that efforts and expectations of parents, teachers, school principals and young debaters had been frustrated by the activists' conduct. Lam added that radical protests and insults will not dampen her resolve at such a critical stage in the effort to promote the government's political reform blueprint. The organizer of the event, the Singtao News Corporation, also condemned the protests.
I think the situation yesterday is quite chaotic, and the situation is very unsatisfactory, in fact. So we are now considering whether we will have some legal reaction or not.
Siu added that ticketing, seat allocation and security arrangements will be reviewed in future events. But People Power Executive Committee member Tam Tak Chi remains unapologetic. He said they chose to vent their dissatisfaction at the political reform process in this way because they've had no other opportunities to communicate with the Chief Secretary. Tam added that students should understand their message and take it as a lesson. But students we spoke to weren't taking it. This one said she agrees with the cause for democracy, but added that the protesters chose the wrong place and time. And this teacher pointed out that students had worked long and hard for this event and that disrupting it was disrespectful. Joan Da Silva, TVB News.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Beijing today amid tensions over disputed areas of the South China Sea. Kerry says Washington is making plans to ensure the freedom of navigation and flight is respected in the region. John Kerry's two-day visit to China is aimed at advancing U.S. priorities ahead of strategic and economic dialogue in Washington later this year. There is word that China is planning to declare an air defense and identification zone over the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. So, in a joint press conference with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Kerry urged China to reduce tension in the region and to focus on the progress their two countries have made.
Indeed, this is a very important year for the United States and China. But as we begin the importance of this year, we also need to focus on the significant progress that we've been making over the course of the last 2 years.
Kerry stated reclamation work in contested waters could have negative consequences on regional stability. The U.S. military has witnessed China carrying out land reclamation and construction at 8 military outposts. This includes the building of an airfield on the Fiery Cross Reef in the Spratly Archipelago. Satellite images also show reclamation work on Subi Reef, creating land masses that, if joined together, could make space for another airstrip. For its part, China says it has every right to set up an air defense and identification zone, but insists current sea conditions aren't yet ripe. To keep the peace, the U.S. plans to send military planes and ships to assert freedom of navigation around the South China Sea. Still, the news had Taiwan and the Philippines crying foul, to which China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson said the Philippines is purposely stirring up trouble.
Hua Chunying accused the Philippines of being a bully and flaunting its connections with the United States to play up the China threat. She also made clear China will not be intimidated and will firmly react to any provocations. That exact sentiment was echoed in Washington, D.C. by China's ambassador to the United States. Kui Tiankai slammed the U.S. for its Cold War mentality, saying America is prone to using force to resolve disputes.
The jury sentenced 21-year-old Dzhokhar Tsarnaev to death for the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings that killed 3 people and wounded more than 260 others. As Alan Bookneer reports, the verdict brought relief and grim satisfaction to many in Boston.
Today the jury has spoken, and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev will pay with his life for his crimes.
It's a sad day. Nobody wants to see what happened, but I think everyone gets some satisfaction.
A somber-looking Tsarnaev stood with his hands folded as he learned his fate. The jury deliberated for almost 15 hours over 3 days, sweeping aside pleas that he was just a 19-year-old kid who fell under the influence of his fanatical older brother. Tsarnaev was convicted last month of all 30 charges against him, including joining his 26-year-old brother Tamerlan, seen here on closed-circuit video, in setting off 2 pressure cooker bombs near the end of the Boston Marathon race on April 15, 2013. The attack and ensuing manhunt that saw Tamerlan killed during a shootout with police paralyzed the city for days.
It is a bittersweet. You know, there's no winner today, but I feel justice for my family. So I'm grateful that the jury took it serious enough to be able to, sentence the appropriate sentence.
Carlos Arredondo assisted victims immediately after the blasts.
We're here and we are tired. We all tired of this.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting
So
it.
we just try to go back home and trying to figure out really what happened here and move on with our lives. So
no one's here celebrating, and if you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different opinions.
Tsarnaev's lawyer Judy Clark left the court without commenting after the verdict. Tsarnaev would be the first extremist executed in the U.S. in the post-9/11 era, though appeals could take years. Alan Bookneer, TVB News.
Well, former top aide to Osama bin Laden was sentenced to life in prison in the U.S. yesterday for conspiring in the deadly 1998 bombings of 2 American embassies in Africa. The district judge in New York said Khalid al-Fawaz was an eager supporter of bin Laden's goals long before the attacks. The judge rejected defense claims al-Fawaz is not a violent man. The 1998 bombings in Kenya and Tanzania killed 224 people, including a dozen Americans. Prosecutors said al-Fawaz was an al-Qaeda leader who directed a military training camp in Afghanistan in 1991, led a terror cell in Kenya in 1993, and ensured bin Laden's 1996 declaration of war against the U.S. reached the world.
The Amtrak train that derailed in Philadelphia on Tuesday may have been hit by an object just before that crash, raising new questions about the deadly accident. A conductor aboard the train said he heard Amtrak engineer Brandon Bastian in a radio conversation with an engineer driving another train in the area. Both said their trains had been hit by a rock or some other projectile. A spokesman for the National Transportation Safety Board said that raises the possibility that Bastian may have been distracted, panicked, or even wounded just prior to the crash. Bastian has told investigators he doesn't recall what happened in the moments before the crash that killed 8 people and injured more than 200.
Still to come tonight in our broadcast, a homicide case in Linoln. Air traffic between Hong Kong and Shanghai seriously disrupted. And the 80th anniversary of the Moscow Metro.
What is a grod?
I don't think it's a coincidence that this gorilla shows up at the very same time we're looking for Wells.
Wells ordered Grod to come after us. If I hadn't seen Jurassic Park, I wouldn't be nearly as frightened right now.